Welcome again. We are talking about the respiratory system development. In this section, we'll see how the lung matures. There are four stages, as we talked about earlier. We'll see how the lung passes through all these four stages, and then finally, we'll see the fetal breathing movements. And we'll think upon it. Why does a fetus need breathing? Because it is an aqueous environment, and the fetus is not. The lungs are not being used. So, what is the purpose of fetus breathing within the amniotic cavity? The maturation of lung has been divided into four stages. These stages are named as the first stage is the pseudoglandular stage, the second stage, the canalicular stage, the third stage is the terminal sac or saccular stage, and the fourth stage is the alveolar stage. Let's take up these stages one by one. So, the pseudoglandular stage, as the name indicates, in this stage, the developing lung bud, it resembles a false gland. So, what is happening? This is the esophageotracheal tube, which is now being divided into the tracheobronchial buds. All right, these are the tracheobronchial buds being formed. In this stage, only the conduction system of the respiratory system is being formed, and it is also very primitive. It is also very early. Only the trachea and the bronchi have been formed. No other element of the respiratory system has yet been formed. In the canalicular stage, what happens? The trachea and the bronchi, they form the respiratory bronchioles. And from the respiratory bronchioles, they are responsible for the formation of further structures, which are the alveolar ducts. At this stage, the canalicula, the conduction system or the highways or the roads are being constructed for the airway, for the air passage, so that the conduction of air can take place throughout the lung. In the terminal stage or the saccular stage, adult sacs or the terminal sacs are being formed. So in this stage, the alveolar ducts which were already formed are now undergo the process of formation of terminal sacs. These are the sacs where the exchange of gases would take place. These are the primitive sacs in which the exchange of gases takes place. Alveolar stage is the stage in which the adult alveoli are formed. There is transformation of these terminal sacs into adult alveoli, and now the lung is at full capacity to perform its function of exchange of gases. Now let's take up these stages in a little detail. So, first of all, we have the pseudoglandular stage. Pseudo means false, gland is a gland. So this is the stage in which the lung bud resembles a gland. It occurs between 5 to 16 weeks of development. Now, the bronchial tree is formed up to the terminal bronchioles. We've talked about this earlier. Elements of the bronchial tree involved in respiration are not formed. So only the conducting pathway has been formed. The respiratory pathway has yet not formed. So respiration is not possible because the respiratory pathway has yet to be formed, and hence the premature fetuses cannot survive if born at this stage. Now moving on to the canalicular stage, which extends from 16 week of development to 26 week of development. Now the respiratory bronchioles and the alveolar ducts are formed. So the respiratory bronchioles are there, the alveolar ducts are there. So somewhat respiration starts. They can take place if required. Few alveolar sacs are also formed. The lung tissue is now very well vascularized. Now, fetus born at the end of this stage can survive if given intensive care, though it requires extensive monitoring and it is very difficult. Again, in the third stage is the saccular stage extending from 26 week to birth. The large number of terminal sacs develop. Now the capillaries bulge into the developing sacs. There is intimate contact between the capillaries of the sac and the endothelium of the capillaries. This permits adequate exchange of gases for survival of fetus if it is born prematurely. However, it is not supposed to be born until the completion of this stage. Fetuses born this stage, they usually survive. And the last stage is the alveolar stage. It extends from 8 months to 8 years. It is the formation of definitive or true alveoli with an increase in their number. So the terminal sacs are now being converted into true alveoli. Type 2 pneumocytes now produce a sufficient amount of surfactant. So very important. Type 2 pneumocyte, there are two types of cells within the adult lungs, type 1 pneumocytes or type 2 pneumocytes. Pneumocytes are actually air cells. So type 1 pneumocytes are thin walled cells. They line the alveoli and are responsible for exchange of gases. Type 2 pneumocytes are responsible for the production of phospholipid-rich surfactant. This surfactant is responsible for lowering the surface tension, and hence it helps the fetus to take its first breath and aeration of the lung. Hence the transition from an aqueous to an aerated environment. Free exchange of gases across the blood-air barrier formed by the epithelium of alveoli and endothelium of capillaries occurs in the alveolar stage since the child has already been born. So, and this is an overview. So on the x-axis we have this age in weeks. Here you can see 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, and so on till 38 weeks. 38 weeks is the optimum time when the birth takes place. These are the generations of bronchi which have been developing since birth. So we saw in a 4th week embryo, we saw the development of the respiratory bud. This is the embryonic period in which all the organs in the embryo are being formed. So at about 5th week, the pseudoglandular stage starts. This is the first stage. At this stage, only the trachea has been divided into the primary bronchi. Now, within the pseudoglandular stage, as we progress, we see the trachea dividing into the primary bronchi forming the secondary bronchi until the formation of the terminal bronchioles. After that, the canalicular stage starts at the 16th week of development. After 16th week of development, we see the formation of respiratory bronchioles. So the components of respiration are they begin to form within the canalicular phase. Now, the canalicular phase extends up to 24 weeks of development. In the canalicular phase, the respiratory bronchioles are the only component being formed. Now, moving on to the saccular phase. In this phase, which starts from the 24th week of development and extends to the 36th week of development, we see the alveolar ducts are being formed. So, further components of the respiratory system, which are actually involved in respiration, are taking place. So, here type 2 pneumocytes also begin to act, and the increase in production of the surfactant. Here you can see there's an increase in surfactant production as we are moving towards the delivery of the fetus. And the alveolar stage, which continues from 8 months, or that is 36th week, to 8 years of life. And during this stage, the adult alveolar sacs, they continue to form. Here you can see the conduction zone. The conduction zone consists of bronchi, bronchioles, and the terminal bronchioles. This is the dead area or the anatomical dead zone of the lung in which no exchange of gases takes place. Then we have the transitional and the respiratory zone. This is the transitional zone, the respiratory bronchioles. The alveolar ducts, these in which this is a transition from the conducting zone to the respiratory zone. And then we have the respiratory areas where the alveolar sacs, the terminal sacs are present, in which the actual exchange of gases takes place. Up here we have the embryonic period up to 8th week of development. That is the period in which all the organs within the body are within the fetus are being formed. And this is the period which is highly susceptible to teratogenesis. And this is the fetal period in which the development of these organs take place. So this is a very nice and very explanatory graph that explains how the development of lung takes place with respect to the timeline. So now, fetal breathing movements. We talked about this earlier in the beginning of this section, that in the beginning of this session actually, that fetus develops in somewhat an aqueous environment. The fetus is surrounded by the amniotic fluid. So why does it need respiration? It is actually getting its oxygen from the mother. So it is not in an aerial environment, and lungs are actually aerial organs that are responsible for exchange of gases. Exchange of gases being the primary word. So let's see what the fetal breathing movements are. They start before birth, shocker. They cause aspiration of amniotic fluid in the lungs. All right. So they're not responsible at this time in development. They're not responsible for the exchange of gases. However, they cause aspiration of amniotic fluid in the lungs. So the amniotic fluid goes into the lungs. Now, the aeration of lung at birth replaces the intra-alveolar fluid. So when the birth happens, there is aeration of lung. It replaces the intra-alveolar fluids by three actual methods: through mouth and nose, by the pressure on the fetus thoracic wall during the delivery. During a vaginal delivery, there's a lot of pressure, and the amniotic contents present within the lung are squeezed out through mouth and the nose. Through the pulmonary arteries, veins, and capillaries, it is rapidly reabsorbed, and through the lymphatics, they also reabsorb the amniotic fluid. So in this section, we saw how the lung develops into how the mature components of the lung develop. We saw the 4 stages of the development of lungs, and we saw what is the role of fetal breathing movements. We saw the fetal breathing movements were not for the excess of oxygen to the fetus, but the development of lung through the amniotic fluid. We also saw this amniotic fluid, how it was cleared from an aerated lung through mouth and nose, through the capillaries, and through the lymphatics. I hope you understood it. Keep watching Scadia.com.